was fascinating. Could you give us something of the flavour of a typical evening in your view, of how these conversations were conducted, and
Yeah.
because it sounds fascinating, but
They would start very casually, and there was no formality in Hillway. You could wander in and out. You could come in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You could come in at 10 o'clock. It didn't matter. There was no formality. There really was no sit-down dinner. Basically, what would happen is, and this is after Mimi especially retired, when she spent more time at home. But the days would begin in the sort of mid to late afternoon with friends starting to knock on the door. There'd be my grandparents' best friend, who was a French dentist called Rose Uren. And she had this extraordinarily over-the-top, almost Clouseau-like accent, but it was a real accent. She was just this incredible presence. And she would zoom up to the front doorway on a moped. She was about 75 years old. She'd zoom up on a moped, and this apparition with a moped's helmet would ring the doorbell. And usually one of the grandkids would open the door, and if it was me, she'd grab me and she'd sort of say, Miri, you didn't tell me Sasha would be here. I would not have come if you told me. And then she would kiss me, and then she'd run it. And so it would always start with sort of the inner circle, sort of no formality at all. And then usually somebody had been invited for dinner. So there'd be this core group, 2 or 3 or 4 people from England or Israel or America or France, so all kinds of different nationalities would descend, and the dinner would start. And usually it would begin in the front living room. And there were distinct sets of books and distinct sort of ways of dealing with the conversation in different rooms. So in the living room, there'd be these overstuffed armchairs, and people would either sit in these overstuffed armchairs drinking wine or tea, or they'd stand in sort of little clusters and they'd talk. And this racket, there was no sense of sort of waiting for one person to finish before another one started. Everyone's talking at once, so it gets noisier and noisier. And at a certain point, Shimon would scream out at the top of his voice, Miri, our guests are getting hungry! And she would start bringing in these sort of platters of food. He would sort of hurry everyone over to the dining room. And for hours, people would sit around the table eating. And again, no formality. I mean, people would just come in and join in, and Mimi would get them up to speed on the meal. And at the very end of the meal, there was always a ritual. Shimon would get up and he'd sort of very theatrically demand silence. And for about 10 seconds, there was silence. And he'd say, I have a very important question. Who wants tea or coffee? To which the answer was either yes, or I'll have tea or coffee, or whatever it was. And then everything would continue again in chaos. And I mean, it really could go on till very, very late in the evening. And usually, almost always they had guests staying. It used to get me a little bit frustrated as a kid, but you could very rarely find the house just you. If I wanted to go and visit my grandparents, it was usually me going to visit my grandparents with 4 or 5 people from around the world staying in different rooms in the house. And that was Hillway. That was how it unfolded. And then it would sort of start again the next day as the guests would start getting up and the conversation would start taking off again. It was sort of endless. It just this perennial circus of people and conversation.
So every day, and many conversations at once.
Every day, many conversations at once, sometimes simultaneously and often in multiple languages. And Shimon really did. I mean, Shimon was as comfortable in Russian as in English, as comfortable in Hebrew and Yiddish. He claimed to speak French, though I'm not convinced on that one. He certainly spoke a smattering of German and various other languages. So just many different languages. And Mimi was always cooking something. When she wasn't cooking, if she wasn't entertaining at that moment, she was on the telephone. And oftentimes she was on the phone with one hand and cooking with the other hand. But, so it was this sort of cacophony of noise and conversation.
Okay.
Yes?
At what age did he start collecting?
When he was a teenager. And I was trying to work out which parts of his story to focus on in this conversation. What I really didn't focus on was the fact that even though he grew up in this deeply rabbinic family, and he came from a long line of very famous rabbis, and his father had been actually sentenced to death under Stalin, and it had been commuted after Maxim Gorky got involved, and he was sent to Siberia instead. But despite all of this, Shimon became a communist in Russia when he was a teenager. So he was living in Moscow, and he got sort of recruited by members of the Jewish intelligentsia in Moscow. They took him to the Yiddish Communist Club, and by the time he was 15, he was reading Karl Marx voraciously, but in secret. It was almost like he had smut. His parents would come in and he'd hide the Karl Marx under the pillow and get out the Torah. But from the age he came to England when he was 15, And certainly within a year or two, he was collecting, it wasn't the rare stuff, he couldn't afford it, but he was collecting political and philosophical material by the time he was 15 or 16. And certainly by the time he was in his early 20s, he was collecting actual, collector's items. And he never stopped until he died, and he was 93 when he died. Yes?
What happened to his collection of books?
Well, you're going to have to forgive me being a little bit vague on this, because one of the complexities of writing a story like this is you're dealing with a lot of people who are alive as well as people who are no longer alive. And chief among the people who are alive are all my family. And so what I've agreed is that I will tell the story of the past, but I will leave it in the past. So the collection is no longer in Hillway, that I will say. But who has what and where, I think I'll leave it a little bit vague and mysterious. Sorry. Yes?
Did the bookshop go under the family name?
The bookshop was called Shapiro, Valentine and Company, and it was actually my grandmother Mimi's family. They bought it in I think either the Victorian, last years of the Victorian era or just afterwards, the very first years of 20th century. And it was this musty old shop on Wentworth Street in the East End, and Petticoat Lane, the great market ran right outside the front door. And it was, I tried to reconstruct it in the book. I've got a lot of photographic images and a lot of oral testimony about it. It was really claustrophobic. It was this really dingy 19th century bookstore, but it was the leading Jewish bookstore in the East End of London. And it supported the family, the extended family, for many, many, many years. Shimon was brought in there in World War II. He'd ended up sort of stranded in London at the beginning of World War II, and he needed a job. And he found this job as just a bookstore assistant, and married the boss's daughter, and then took over the store. And they actually, the first time one of the things I found like incredibly I was delving deeper and deeper and deeper, and I found these letters indicating that at one point in the 1940s, the bookstore had gone into a partnership with 11 other investors, and they bought something connected with Rashi. Rashi was the great scholar of the 11th century, by far the most important figure for that period in religious Jewish commentary. And even in the 1940s, his work was worth an absolute fortune. What I don't know, because I couldn't find it, is what Rashi it was. I don't know if it was a fragment of a fragment. I don't know if it was... I don't think there are original Rashi manuscripts around, but it could have been first generation afterwards. But it was worth an absolute fortune, even in the 40s. And it was an investment. They sold it, and that was how they funded their bookstore for many, many years. Anyone else?
I hate to ask this question after your course about the real books, but are you going to have this book as an e-book?
It is an e-book, it's on Kindle. So if you go onto Amazon, you'll see there are two ways of getting it, and one of them is Kindle. But I must say, like all writers, I'm sort of unhealthily obsessed with Amazon rankings, usually to my detriment, because, so I look and I get depressed, but I looked the other day and I noticed that the print version actually was selling, but to my knowledge, nobody was buying the Kindle, and it made me very, very happy. But yes, you can buy it on a Kindle. Anyone else? Yeah.
So this was a massive kind of project for you to go for, of course, especially because it was so personal. So can you talk a bit about the process of writing?
I will. Let me just check my watch. There's my train. I've got like about 7 or 8 minutes.
Yeah.
I wrote it in conjunction with other projects. I don't think I could have written it just doing this. First of all, monetarily it wouldn't have made sense, but even setting aside all the fiscal constraints, it was too emotionally draining. I had to have other projects. So I started working on it very soon after my granddad died. I wrote an essay in The Guardian in their Letters and Lives section, 2,000-word essay about Shimon's life. And the book project, I started thinking at that point about how I would construct a tale of their lives. And it took me a while to sort of realize that I was writing a memoir, but it was a memoir not really with the people as the central characters at first, but with the book as the central character. With the house as the central character. I had to write a memoir of an inanimate object, of the rooms of the house and all the crystalline structures that went into creating collection. And once I realized that, it became much, much easier because I realized I could, in a sense, drape the personalities over the books. So I would tell the story of the ideas in a given room. And I would try and do it chronologically. There were clearly parts of the collection that were compiled earlier in Schimmann's life and parts that were much later. The socialist collection was earlier. I don't think he collected much valuable socialist material after the 1960s. The Judaica starts in the 50s basically and continues right up into his death. And so there are different rooms which can tell different time periods in their lives. And there are different personalities. You know, if I want to talk about the 1940s, people like Eric Hobsbawm coming into the house, I decided I would sort of situate them in the living room because that was where the socialist collection, the sort of active socialist history collection was. If I wanted to tell the story of people like Jack Lunzer, some of the great Judaica collectors who were coming in and out of the house, it made sense to tell their story in the upstairs front room, which was where very, very rare medieval manuscripts were kept, and Kabbalistic documents, and documents about false messiahs like Sabbatai Zevi. They were all in that room. So I could bring alive historical characters that were in the books, and I could also bring alive personalities, but I had to know which room to situate everyone in. And that for me just took months and months of sort of wrestling in my head. You know, what am I going to do? Where am I going to put these people? Which room comes first? I opened the book in their bedroom, and you know that's a weird place to open it. You'd think it would be the front door, but actually my first memory was their bedroom. I was 3 years old. I was stuck in a pea soup fog in London, and I had to stay at their house overnight. And I just remember being next to them in the bed, surrounded by the shadows of books. And I don't know if anyone's ever slept in the library, but it's a weird thing. It really is weird, the shadows you get in a room like that. And that's one of my first memories. So, you know, to me that was a no-brainer that the book would open surrounded by the shadows, you know, shadows in the bedroom. And then after that, just as I said, an awful lot of ruthless editing. Because, you know, it could have been 1,000 pages long and nobody would have had the patience for it. I've probably got time for one more question if there is, and then we're going to sprint.
Last question.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about the house and the enclosed space of the house. Was there a garden to this house?
There was a garden there. It was actually, no, I write about it in the book, it was a lovely but untended garden, or marginally tended. And one of the reasons I write about it is that my great-granddad, who was a rabbi, came out of a very austere yeshiva schooling system, which was called the Musar philosophy, M-U-S-I-A-R. And it was very aesthetic, and it was about breaking down ego, and it was about learning to, I mean, in some ways, and again, this is just my sort of feeling, but reading about it and reading testimonies about it, in some ways it's almost like sort of Hindu asceticism, just incredibly ascetic, almost monastic approach to life. And a lot of the Musar buildings looked very unkempt because that wasn't where their energies went. And my cousin Ralph Samuel, who spent an awful lot of time at Hillway and was immersed in the communist culture in the 40s and 50s, he wrote a book toward the end of his life called The Lost Road of British Communism. And he talks about the aesthetic sensibility of the communists in Britain at the time. It was very similar to the Musar aesthetic. It was all about not tending to bourgeois concerns like what your garden looked like and whether your plumbing worked and whether there were cracks in the paint. So everything was untended. It was wild. And so I write quite a lot about it because it was actually a huge garden with a lovely apple tree at the back, but it was completely overrun most of the time. Shimon loved sitting there at the end of his life in his kitchen looking out the window at the squirrels. And on that note, I'm going to make a dash. Thank you very much.